Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, the latest European Parliamentary Research Service roundtable, held as always these days online. And this is a digital roundtable devoted to a very important institutional issue within the European Union, the question of how the Council of Ministers and the European Council take decisions. As those of you who've studied EU politics and history will know, the whole question of votes and vetoes in the Council of Ministers was a critical issue for many decades in the evolution of the European Union, especially following the empty chair crisis and the Luxembourg Compromise of General de Gaulle in the mid-1960s. Really, for about 20 years, until the Single European Act in 1986-87, EU decision-making was more or less frozen in many areas, depending on the need to secure a unanimous outcome in the Council, and even where qualified majority voting was provided for as the decision-making method, very often member states would insist on that unanimity principle. Things started to change following the Single European Act, and the Luxembourg Compromise gradually fell into disuse. Now, conventionally, in this city, Brussels, where I'm speaking from, here in the European Parliamentary Research Service, the question tends to be posed of why and how should QMV be extended to all remaining areas of EU decision-making? But this roundtable seeks to address a slightly different question, which is how, in practice, do qualified majority voting and unanimity really work in the Council? And to discuss this, we put together a distinguished panel of both practitioners and academic experts who either have been experiencing this in their daily lives for many years or have been writing and thinking about this question from a research point of view. And in alphabetical order, we have today Richard Corbett, who's currently serving on the secretariat for the Conference on the Future of Europe, and previously was a member of the European Parliament over several decades. He's author of several academic books, including The European Union, How Does It Work? Professor Desmond DINAN from George Mason University in the United States, author also of successive volumes, including Ever Closer Union, Europe Recast, and the European Union in Crisis, and one of the world's most prominent historians in the history of EU institutions. Professor Sara HAGEMANN, currently Professor of Political Science at Copenhagen University, until recently at the London School of Economics, and a former think tanker here in Brussels at the EPC and at CEPS. Leonardo SCHIAVO, who very recently retired after a decade in the job as Director General for External Relations in the Council Secretariat, and a former chef de cabinet to a High Representative for CFSP. And last but not least, Paulien van der Velde, who's with us in the European Parliamentary Research Service as one of our first visiting scholars, and is a PhD researcher at the European University Institute in Florence, and is doing a study on how free trade agreements are decided, an area where, ostensibly at least, qualified majority voting occurs, but in practice there's sometimes the need legally, and very often practically, for unanimity among the member states. So we're going to be looking at the actual operation of decision-making in the Council. When and why is voting held or not held? How different is the reality of lawmaking under the two main voting methods, QMV and unanimity? Has voting become more contested over time? Do countries who are facing potentially negative majorities behave in a different way, and has that changed over time? And specifically, has co-decision changed the decision-making dynamic now that the European Parliament is a much more central player, and does that favour certain member states in the Council process? And how influential are the Council Presidency and the Council Secretariat in shaping how the various choices are framed and made? So, without further ado, we're going to go over to Richard to ask him in the first instance to set out his thinking from both the perspective of having worked for many years in the European Parliament, both as a member and as a staffer, and also having experienced close up the operation of the Council system when he was a political advisor to a president of the European Council. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Anthony. The first thing I would say is to look at QMV in its context. It is a system that is unique to the European Union, and it's not a simple majoritarian system because a qualified majority in itself needs a high threshold. Under the old system of weighted votes by member states, it was over 70% of the weighted votes. Now it needs 55% of the member states, representing nearly 2/3 of the population. So in itself, it requires a quite high level of consensus, not unanimity, as we will come on to, but it's not a simple majority system. Furthermore, in most cases under the treaty, a qualified majority can approve a Commission proposal, but it needs unanimity to change it. So this qualified majority is allowed if it's to approve something that has been drawn up by a common institution that is officially charged with looking at the common interest. QMV is not possible but for member state proposals where member states bargain and try and build up majorities themselves for their own proposal, perhaps rival proposals, which would accentuate differences in the Council. QMV is for a Commission proposal, and it can only be changed by unanimity or by the Commission agreeing to an amendment, in which case, of course, a qualified majority can approve it. So it's a special system that needs to be looked at in the context of the overall interinstitutional balance. And of course, when it's legislation, in almost all cases, such decisions require the approval of the European Parliament as well. That's important to note when looking at the nature of QMV. The invitation to this event pointed out rightly that every treaty change has extended the field of QMV. But it says the pattern of trying to secure the support of the largest number of states possible has continued to mould the Council's institutional culture. And I'd say, yes, indeed, that is the case. That's inherent on this special nature of QMV with its high threshold. But there is a world of difference in negotiations within the Council where a veto is possible and where it is not possible. If you are a minister around the table and you are opposed to a proposal or you intensely dislike it, and you have a veto because unanimity is required, you can sit back, read your newspaper, and just put up your finger at the end to block it. I'm exaggerating to make the point. But if you could be outvoted, even in a system where everyone's trying to reach agreement across the board, if you could be outvoted, you cannot just be perfectly unreasonable, because you might provoke the others to outvote you. A qualified majority can be used to circumvent an unreasonable minority, or a minority of one or a slightly larger number. It changes the dynamic of the negotiation. If you're that minister who doesn't like a proposal but could be outvoted, well, you put your newspaper to one side, you sit up, you try and achieve a compromise. That's the difference. I think it was Joseph Weiler who said that before the Luxembourg Compromise fell into disuse, QMV negotiations were conducted with the shadow of a potential veto over them. Since then, they are conducted with the shadow of a potential vote over them. So even when consensus is the outcome, it's no longer the lowest common denominator. It helps make better decisions. That being said, votes do happen. There is pressure for votes all the time, especially when you're coming up to deadlines, legal deadlines or political deadlines in practice where decisions have to be taken, and you look as though you're not going to get consensus within the Council. Then, of course, there is pressure for votes. There is pressure for votes when it's clear that there are insurmountable political decisions and a clear large majority wants that decision and is refusing to be blocked. that perhaps happens more frequently now with an enlarged union. A crucial point nowadays, since I think it took 2 years after the Single European Act for the Council to modify its rules of procedure, but under its rules of procedure, a vote must be held at the request of either the presidency or the Commission or a single member state if a simple majority agrees that a vote must be taken. Simple majority agrees the chair must move to hold a vote. So that has helped as well in this dynamic that I was describing, the pressure, the shadow of a possible vote putting pressure on for a compromise. All that being said, there are still areas that require unanimity. And if you think about when the EU is most often in the news as being in crisis or in deadlock or unable to do something, it is in those areas where unanimity is required, is still required. And they are important fields, so common foreign and security policy, where even a declaration condemning the situation in Belarus can be vetoed by a single minister around the table. In agreeing an MFF, we're not talking about raising the ceilings of own resources, but within those own resources, just a multi-annual budget needs unanimity. Very topical question, the rule of law. If you wanted to go so far as to deal with a member state by suspending its rights under the procedures of the treaty, you need unanimity of all the other member states. So 2 member states backing each other up paralyzes that procedure. Very topical, very controversial. And of course, anything to do with taxation of multinational companies and so on needs unanimity. There are other examples. The EU is coming up again and again with an incapacity to act because of its decision-taking procedures in the field that requires unanimity. Now, in some cases, there are possible ways around that. Enhanced cooperation. Can enhanced cooperation be used as a similar threat, as it were, a shadow of saying, okay, if you don't find a compromise, we'll do it without you? More difficult. But nonetheless, in some circumstances, that is clearly a possibility. Can also use a procedure under Article 31(1) of the TEU Treaty when it comes to the common foreign and security policy, where there is a voluntary abstention by a member state allowing the Union to take a decision, with that state opting out of the action concerned. But that only works by voluntary if the countries concerned or country concerned agrees. Not a very strong tool. So then the question comes up, can you change this situation? Can you further extend the field of qualified majority voting? There are, as we know, a number of passages in the treaty that allows a unanimous decision of the European Council, or in some cases the Council, to extend the field of qualified majority voting, but they need unanimous agreement. And of course, finally, there is treaty change, which again needs unanimous agreement and national ratification on top of it. So very high hurdles to extending the field of qualified majority voting. But as Anthony pointed out, up to now, every IGC that has revised the treaty has indeed extended the field as part of a wider compromise. So if we come into a new treaty revision, that's possible. The only other way around a blockage, where successive vetoes of one member state or a small minority continue to block the union where a majority wants to act, is the possibility of a separate treaty. Huge problems with that, legal problems, political problems, but let's not forget it has been done. The so-called fiscal compact is the most recent significant example of that. Causes all kinds of other difficulties in the union system, but it is a way around a totally unreasonable veto in cases where, for the vast majority, the union must act. So those are my introductory comments. Sorry for having been a bit too long.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Very, very useful scene setter indeed. And now for a more historical perspective, over to Desmond DINAN, who I think is joining us from Washington, DC. So thanks also very much for getting up so early to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a great pleasure to be here. It is indeed early in the morning. It's not yet 8 o'clock. I don't usually get up early in the morning, but I'm delighted to do so for the opportunity to discuss qualified majority voting. I don't usually have that opportunity here. As you said, Anthony, I will give somewhat of an historical perspective, but I do also want to move to the present, and I want to draw on the past in order to see if there are lessons that are relevant to the present. And I would begin by following up on your introductory remarks. That is the extent to which discussions about qualified majority voting have been contested and have been contentious in the history of the European Union. In fact, if you look at the institutional history of European integration, this particular issue has been the most contentious, and it has triggered the most serious discussions, and indeed, I would say the most serious constitutional crisis in the history of the European Union, the empty chair crisis. It has been a major issue in accession negotiations, including the UK's accession negotiations in the early 1970s, as well as the most recent accession negotiations. And it's a question that has dominated intergovernmental conferences, as we have seen, from the Single European Act all the way up to the present. That is, the efforts to rescue the constitutional treaty in the form of initially a reform treaty, later the Lisbon Treaty. Now, what have the issues of contention been? Well, first of all, the scope of qualified majority voting, that is, the policy fields in which QMV should be used. Second, the modalities of qualified majority voting. When it was a weighted system, then the question was, well, the number of votes that should be allocated to each member state, as well as the threshold for a qualified majority, which was very important not only in determining the formation of qualified majority, but also a blocking minority. Because I think one way of thinking of qualified majority voting is not so much a quest to form a qualified majority, but to overcome a blocking minority. Another question that arose informally, but not in formal treaty negotiations, is the question of an emergency break. That has arisen more recently, but I'm talking about historically. You mentioned the empty chair crisis, and the resolution of that crisis, the Luxembourg Compromise, that amounted to an emergency break. It gave members an opportunity to pull that break by saying, no, we don't want a vote to be taken because of our concern about a vital national interest or a very important national interest. And most recently, the questions are concerns about and contention concerning qualified majority voting has been to do with transparency and openness, how to open the system, how to make it more transparent. And indeed, when you consider historically the rationale for qualified majority voting, you wonder why it has been so contentious. Because the rationale quite simply is greater efficiency. And empirically, we know that the greater use of qualified majority voting has resulted in greater efficiency in European community and European Union decision-making. And when you consider what that means from a political point of view, greater efficiency means more results. More results, well, depending on the results, I know, can mean more approval for the political system. And that improves the output legitimacy of the European Union. So not only does QMV improve efficiency, it can also, and it does, I think, improve the legitimacy of the system. And these are all characteristics of good governance. And so the paradox, I think, of the contention over qualified majority voting historically is if qualified majority voting empirically and indeed philosophically improves governance, why has it been so difficult to address all of these questions? And I think the reason for that is because of national positions, that governments have taken positions at key times in the history of the EU when discussing qualified majority voting. And those positions have depended on perceived national interests, sometimes a national principle or a perceived principle that unanimity should be the norm in voting in international organizations. And let's face it, sometimes national or indeed personal pride. What I'm describing here is, in fact, the empty chair crisis, because there you had personal and national pride. There you had a perceived national interest in not extending the use of qualified majority voting, in particular because of French concerns at the time about the consequences for that of extended qualified majority voting for France in areas such as agriculture, because the common agricultural policy was being put in place, and trade. And you also had a perceived national principle, as I said, the Gaullist principle that countries should not be outvoted in international organizations. The resolution, we know, was the Luxembourg Compromise, which I describe as an emergency brake, allowing a member state to pull that brake if it claimed that an important national interest was at stake. Now here I'm going to jump to the present and ask, what is the relevance of this today? Well, clearly the Luxembourg Compromise is a thing of the past. Occasionally one hears reference to it and smiles, of course, because it's such an antique thing. But countries still have perceived national interests, and sometimes those national interests are perceived by those countries to be extremely important, if not vital. Countries still have their pride, and sometimes national pride can intrude on decision and personal pride on decision making. And some countries, and this may change over time, may also have or adhere to the principle that QMV should not be extended. And that's certainly the case, I think, with foreign policy and security and defense. So national interests still exist. It's not possible to pull that particular emergency brake, but I do think that there is still in Brussels today a deference to the notion of a very important or a vital national interest. The problem, of course, with this historically and with this today is, first of all, there are many more member states. There are 27 member states, so potentially many more national interests, including vital national interests. A country would not use that language anymore, but instead a government would say, we have red lines. Now, there are all kinds of red lines and reasons for red lines, but one reason for a red line may be because we perceive this particular issue to be a vital interest. And even though the voting rule exists for QMV, we would rather not have this issue considered. So I think one question is, as I would say, I think there is deference to this notion. It may be in the political culture of decision-making in the European Union, but to what extent does it matter today? But there are differences today when considering this question. And these are contextual, but very important. One is there is much more transparency today. We know much more about what goes on in the Council. I know that much of what happens in the Council may happen in the corridor, and there's a reason why ministers may take their discussions to the corridor, because they're trying to avoid that kind of transparency or scrutiny. But generally, we know much more about what happens in the Council as a result of voting records and so forth. So there's greater transparency. Also, national parliaments in general are much more interested in what's going on in the Council. I say in general because it varies enormously from country to country. And of course, the other context is anti-Brussels populism. I was going to say skepticism, but that's too broad. But a virulent form of skepticism, anti-Brussels populism. And what that does, it potentially, and I say potentially only, it can make it more difficult for member states to operate in the Council because of more scrutiny and more public interest. I think in general, because the issues discussed in qualified majority voting are so technical, they tend to escape this kind of populist scrutiny or populist reaction. But what can countries do, or what can a member state do if it feels that it has a strong national interest to defend? Well, it can try to move the question up to the European Council. And the European Council, as we know, is treaty bound not to involve itself in legislative decision making, but it can reach a political agreement on a legislative file, and it has done so in the past. Of course, the difficulty with that is then the voting rule changes to unanimity, even if the decision may be taken by qualified majority voting in the Council, and then there's more scrutiny, because by definition, the European Council is much more open and there is much more scrutiny of what goes on there, and people in member states can relate more to the European Council and can know more about what goes on around the European Council than they can about the Council of the European Union. A couple of other points, both historical and contemporary. Some points about the United Kingdom. Because I think the United Kingdom has been a key player in the history of the institutional history of the European Union, and certainly in the history of qualified majority voting as well, and a very good practitioner of QMV, very good at operating QMV when it was a member. A number of quick points. One is that the Luxembourg Compromise featured reasonably prominently in the accession negotiations all the way back in the early 1970s, precisely because it allowed the government at the time to address concerns that many opponents of joining the European community at the time had, that Britain would be outvoted on key questions. And the government at the time was able to say, no, 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 because there's this thing called the Luxembourg Compromise, and that will protect us. So the UK government was, and successive governments for some time, were quite Gaullist in their approach to qualified majority voting. Ironically, that changed under Margaret Thatcher, because Thatcher was a great proponent of the single market program, and she realized that for that to come into existence, then the logjam in voting in the council would have to be overcome, and that there would have to be use of qualified majority voting. So one of the greatest champions of the extension of qualified majority voting, and whose championing of the single market program and of qualified majority voting then opened the door to further treaty change, which she did not want to happen, we know. In fact, what's interesting, I think, one of the many interesting things about Margaret Thatcher and single market program and what became the Single European Act is that initially she wanted the equivalent of a Luxembourg Compromise. She wanted a political agreement amongst member states to vote on questions, on issues that would make it possible to implement the single market. Let's call it the Milan Compromise, because of course the key discussion on whether there would be a treaty change, whether there would be an intergovernmental conference, took place in Milan in 1985. And irony of ironies, Thatcher was outvoted in the European Council. A vote took place in the European Council in 1985 on whether or not to hold an intergovernmental conference on treaty change, a key purpose of which would be to extend qualified majority voting. Thatcher wanted to extend qualified majority voting, but not through treaty change. She was outvoted on that question in the European Council. Another couple of quick points about the UK, which I think are relevant. Speaking of the European Council, another occasion when a vote took place, but this time under qualified majority voting, was of course in 2014 on the question of who the Commission, European Council should nominate as Commission President. David Cameron, UK Prime Minister at the time, was one of two in the European Council who insisted on a vote, not because he thought he might prevail, but because he wanted to be seen to be voting against President Juncker, who was a hate figure in the United Kingdom of Eurosceptics. I'm citing that, first of all, as a rare occasion when a vote took place in the European Council, but second, as a reason why, in this case, UK Prime Minister Cameron, but often a reason why member states insist on a vote being taken, because sometimes they want to be seen to be outvoted in order to appeal to or appease domestic opinion. And a final point I could make more about the United Kingdom is the departure of the United Kingdom has strengthened the position of larger member states in the double majority voting system, and it has weakened the position of small member states. And it has also resulted in a scramble, might be too strong a word, but a realignment of coalitions on policy issues, because the UK is not a member anymore, and countries which felt that they could reliably depend on the United Kingdom because of their shared policy preferences now have to look elsewhere. I'm thinking primarily of the Netherlands and of Sweden. Now, speaking of the double majority, which came about relatively recently, the reason for the double majority was a quest for fairness, a quest for equity. Fairness for the big member states. Now, we don't usually hear that because we always presume that small member states are put upon, and whenever the system should be made more fair or equitable, it should be in favor of small member states. But in this case, it was the large member states which argued quite convincingly, I think, that over time, with the system of weighted voting for qualified majority, and the accession of so many new member states, many of them small member states, that large member states, relatively speaking, were being disadvantaged. And so the double majority was introduced to redress that imbalance. The problem is, of course, that one person's balance is another person's imbalance. And now there is a perception, and I think because of Brexit, there might be some, there's a great degree of truth to that, that the balance has shifted again, or more so against the small member states and too much in favor of the large member states. Some other points about the contemporary conduct of qualified majority voting. The high priests of qualified majority voting are the deputy permanent representatives in CORBETT 1 and the Mertens group. These are the people who really know the system and who understand the system, plus some officials, of course, in the council secretariat who play a key role, and some officials in the council as well. Of course, members of working groups understand the system also, but really the key players, as I said, are the deputy perm reps and officials, some officials in the commission, but especially in the council secretariat. Their main objective is to reach agreement as early as possible in the form of A points, and then present those A points as conclusions or definitive agreements at meetings of the Council of Ministers. Their main fear is that at a meeting of the council, a minister will go rogue, that a minister from a member state will not adhere. I'm not suggesting that they would reopen an A point. That has happened, but very, very rarely. But on the points that are still up for discussion, that they may go off script as far as the permanent representative of that particular member state is concerned. And why might they do that? Precisely because of the points I was making earlier, because of the context now of more Euroscepticism and greater transparency and so forth. A comment on the presidency, if I may. The council presidency is key, but I don't think that the presidency, the rotating 6-month presidency, can be conceived of without linking it to the secretariat of the council. The presidency is really the country in the presidency plus the council secretariat. Now, the extent of the collaboration between the country and the presidency and the council secretariat depends on the country. Larger member states, more experienced member states may rely less on the council, the secretariat. I mean of the council, but I think small member states rely a lot, and that's why the council secretariat is key. The pressure, of course, on presidencies to get things done is partly self-induced, but it's also real. It depends on the semester in the year, and it depends on the time of the institutional cycle, how much actually needs to get done, or the extent of the pressure on the presidency to get things done. And one other point I would raise, but more as a question at the moment, is the impact of the trio presidency on the functioning of qualified majority voting, because it does introduce a new dimension, and it helps especially, I think, to strengthen those presidencies, the presidencies of countries that are relatively new and relatively inexperienced. And I would just conclude by saying that when we're thinking about qualified majority voting, we have to think about the variability of qualified majority voting. What I mean is the differences that exist among member states, and there are 27 of them now, although not all of them are equally interested in a subject or in a particular file. The differences, another aspect of variability is the differences in domestic interest in an issue, the differences in domestic oversight over ministers when they operate in Brussels. I mean differences amongst member states, media interest nationally, think tanks nationally, universities nationally, national parliaments themselves. Their level of interest differs enormously. And the final point I would make has to do with political culture, if you like, or administrative culture, which is not all council configurations are the same. And I don't mean literally in terms of what they address, but I mean, of course, not all of them legislate, but even those that legislate, they have a different culture. And within that culture, there are differences in openness and degrees of comfort with qualified majority voting. So I would say that there are aspects of political culture that need, and administrative culture, that need to be taken on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Desmond. Very interesting, and thank you for the deep dive into the history as well as the current practice of voting in unanimity in the council. And I just point out that we're almost 160 people online at the moment, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions and hopefully elicit answers from the various panelists shortly. So please feel free to enter a question in the Q&A function, or you can do it through the chat function to EPRS WebEx. And we'll try and take as many of those questions as possible after we've completed the round. And we're now going over to Copenhagen, where Sara's going to join us and to reflect upon the research I know that both you've been conducting and on which you're an expert on how in practice QMV and unanimity function in the Council. Sara.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you to all of you for joining today. It's a very a great pleasure to be on this distinguished panel, and I must say that I'm living the experience of the QMV debates and differences in views, as I have recently moved from London, in fact only a month ago. And I'm now based in Copenhagen, and just had a conversation earlier today in the foreign ministries, and gosh, the differences are really quite stark in how to think about decision making at the European level. What I thought to address, also in view of everything that has already been covered, which are great insights, with the big view, is to look into some more details about the observable consequences of the decision making going from unanimity to QMV. We have seen this, which from a research perspective is a fantastic experiment, so to speak, in that there have been different stages, there have been different moves under different circumstances. So of course, decision making of an EU of 6, 12, 15, 27 all looks very differently. And the decision rules are of extreme importance in structuring the end results, as well as the game that governments play and the negotiation game that is played in getting to final conclusions and agreements. And we can fortunately look at data that now runs several decades, and we can see how areas have changed their dynamics as they have moved in the direction of QMV. I'd like to elaborate on three things here. First of all, what are the overall tendencies that we see, for example, regarding the level of contest? Secondly, I'd like to elaborate on who it is that contest in the Council and why. And thirdly, a point that was very briefly made regarding the consequences for transparency, and one could speculate whether therefore also legitimacy of decision making. But I'll try to be brief, as I know we all would like to have a good discussion. But nevertheless, the observable consequences is that we have seen areas over time, more and more areas moving into QMV, but as Richard pointed out, with the move to QMV came also an additional decision maker with the European Parliament. So it is true that QMV was introduced to higher the efficiency in the Council decision making, but with the additional actor in the game, we have not seen a higher efficiency in terms of the time that it takes to legislate. But bearing in mind the vast volume and growth in legislation we have also seen over the years, there is no doubt that QMV for the member states certainly pushes governments to quicker reach agreements, and tough luck if you're not necessarily part of the majority. And this is an important point. So as was explained before, this changes the behavior of governments. With the risk of being outvoted, you therefore participate to influence the proposal, even if you may not necessarily be fully in favor of the whole package. But you are certainly trying to get on board and have a solid fingerprint on legislation that looks likely to go through with a majority, with a qualified majority, I should say, in the Council. But one thing that has changed in the areas that have QMV over the years since we first started witnessing the actual application of the QMV rules is that it used to be costly to vote against when we had a QMV vote, and that has changed. It is still costly to some degree. You are putting your country, your government, and your name down on the decision record when you vote against. And that is not always a welcome position to take with the majority. But nevertheless, it happens more frequently than it used to be. And the reason is that, as I believe Desmond pointed out, governments at times have a need to not only signal their discontent with the policy discussions or the policy proposal, but they may also have a need for signaling to audiences within the decision group at the EU level, to the European Parliament, or to their domestic audiences. And in my research, I have looked at how that dynamic has prevailed, and increasingly so over the past years, especially since enlargement in 2004. And a main driver here is whether or not you have national parliaments that actively take an interest in EU policy making. So this is important to bear in mind when we look at whether QMV is a tool to ensure more efficiency within the Council. And the answer is that it is in most cases, but there are cases where we then see the level of contest going up, and therefore also even inability to muster a majority, because voting requires the government to put their name on the voting record. Another point I thought to highlight is that even in the areas where we have seen a move to QMV, it's not uniformly applied. I think this was alluded to before, but certainly in the areas that have traditionally been governed by consensus, strong consensus and unanimity rules, especially within justice and home affairs, for example, we see fewer instances of contest also in the voting records than we do in other areas. So there is a tendency to hold on to the same culture, the culture of unanimity, the political culture that was mentioned before, even when we have QMV rules in place, and that could be expected for any new areas that would be considered for the QMV extension. But let me move to also say a bit about what it is, who it is that contest policies and why. As we've sort of briefly referred to, of course, a government who vigorously refuse or have opposition to a policy proposal would either veto or vote against under the QMV rule. But we can see that there are governments who are in any case more willing to put their name down, even if that contest is as deep as you would think if you were to veto. So for example, the opposition countries that we, the countries that we see most frequently in opposition in the Council are countries that are northern, richer countries that contribute to the EU budgets. They are countries that strategically pick the areas where they have a specific domestic interest. So here it is often in internal market, in budget negotiations and otherwise that we see those northern countries vote against most frequently. And we see that there is still a grouping within the Council which comes out across policy areas, but which is not permanent. So we see that voting together, the northern countries and some of the Central European countries most frequently vote together both in favor or in opposition, whereas we have a southern grouping and a central and eastern grouping. Now, I'm being very divisive here between these groupings, and they are not sort of an expression for all the many policies that are put through the council, but they do exist when it comes to the opposition in voting. Now, that may not be the case when we have the unanimity rule, but we do not know about this in terms of the data and the voting records. We also see that this has changed over time, and it changes with governments. There is a change in position when governments move from the center right to the center left, and depending on also the majority minority constellations within the Council and within the European Parliament and the dynamics across the two institutions, governments will again strategically behave according to both their policy interest regarding the proposals on the table, as well as the audiences that they feel they need to send a signal to. And this is again important to bring out in our analysis of what the consequences are of having QMV in all policy areas, or more policy areas than are currently the case. Lastly, very briefly, I wanted to turn to the point about transparency, because it is true that we know more about the workings of the council and we have more information coming from the council meetings. But there is, in this case, a very big difference between the areas where we have unanimity and where we have QMV. And this is, of course, mainly because the European Parliament is also now an actor, and therefore more information becomes available to the European Parliament, to the national parliaments, but also at times to the wider public. So there is another element here to think about regarding both the efficiency as well as the legitimacy of the decision process, and it's an important one. There is, of course, those who would always advocate for higher transparency in all legislative areas of the EU. We have done analysis that shows that it's a mixed picture, that transparency can do a lot of good, as one often assumes in politics, but there can also be some drawbacks. And those drawbacks can have an effect on the efficiency of the decision process, on the behavior of individual politicians, and those are important to keep in mind. I'm happy to elaborate on that later on, but I don't want to overrun on the time here, but I think that those are issues we also need to consider very carefully when we look at any moves from unanimity to QMV. But Anthony, let me finish here, and I'll be happy to elaborate on in the Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Sara, for that. Extremely interesting insights into the evolving research. And now I'd like to go back to Brussels and talk to Leonardo, who's got a wealth of experience on the ground in doubtless innumerable meetings of council working groups, CORBETT, and Council and European Council formations. Listening to this debate, how does it seem to you?
Well, it seems interesting, first of all. I mean, it's very interesting to get the wider picture, I mean, and to see how many people perceive the processes that, I mean, other people live from within. I think Richard has quite an extraordinary experience of doing this in a couple of houses at least. But I think there are some issues which are peculiar to the council functioning, which I think are worth highlighting. Sara was referring to the issues of transparency and how transparency is bringing about more clarity and definition of the way member states behave. In most cases, I must say, the short transparency sessions that are devoted by the council to the formality of adopting decisions will consist, sorry to say, of a lengthy reading by an unenthusiastic council president, I mean, to use an euphemism, of a litany of legal acts which have been adopted at the beginning of the session. I mean, this is about, how these things are communicated, but I think you must understand the reality that voting in the Council does not have a topical moment, such as in the European Parliament plenary. I mean, votes are cast in a way that actually follows a very intense and heavily scripted negotiating process, which takes place at a multi-layered itinerary, starting with the technical working groups and all the way up to CORBETT, to the ambassadors level, who, as you know, meet in two distinct formations depending on the subject at hand. CORBETT is undoubtedly the place where the final arbitrations in most cases take place. I mean, even though there may be issues that will need further discussion or fine tuning at the level of ministers, but I mean, do not dismiss the point that ambassadors in CORBETT are instructed by their governments, not just by their ministers. They receive clear political instructions. I mean, on the positioning of the member states, and very often this position will have to be cross-checked within their internal system with parliament scrutiny and so on. Sara is familiar with this. There are very member states who have committees which are very focused on these questions. So I think there may not be many Hamilton moments, so to speak. I mean, in the transparency sessions of the Council decision making, but I mean the process is a serious process. It's complicated, and it brings a result. About the role of the presidency, I mean, which very often comes up in this debate. You must understand that, is the Council process systemically leaning towards appeasing member states' national interests and demands, even when, reaching a decision by QMV would be, within the grasp of the negotiator? I think there's no doubt that this is the case. But I mean, I do not find this objectionable politically. I mean, this has to do with the role of honest broker of the presidency, especially the rotating presidency. And there is no way around this. I mean, every council chairperson at any level will feel bound to promote and then reach as inclusive an agreement as possible, seemingly irrespective of applicable voting rules. I say seemingly because naturally, the voting power of each and every member state is constantly computed and factored in at every stage in the process, especially to make sure that any opposition to the final agreement will not jeopardize the decision. And so, I mean, when Sara was referring, to the more relevant pattern of, negative votes and sometimes formal declaration attached to the minutes and so on, I mean, this is part of a scripted itinerary, if you want, of decision making, in which some of the member states can, actually advertise with their own public opinion and parliaments, etc., that they have held their position to the bitter end. Whereas, I mean, in reality, the process has made it to its final conclusions. I mean, and these processes are stage managed in a way, I mean, that can reach conclusions. I think the rotating presidency has another important feature, I think, which is more of a diplomatic and political nature attached to it, and that is, that there is some sort of a memory pack that moves from one presidency to the next, and that includes, I mean, performance, but also behavior vis-a-vis the rest of the table. I mean, you don't want to be seen during the semester in which you hold the presidency as someone who has, rolled over very serious domestic political concerns by anyone, because at the end of the semester, I mean, you will be another member states around the table for the next 13 years or so. I mean, and this kind of revolving doors, attitude and management of the room will count for a long period of time. Now, attached to the role of the president, there is always the role of the secretariat. It was mentioned by Desmond. I mean, and it's always a bit in the background of this debate. Does the council secretariat exert any undue influence in the decision-making process? Now, I don't want to see the advocate as the advocate of a corporate view on this, given my background. But I must make one point, I think, quite clearly. If you look at all the actors in the decision-making process and the way they behave, actually the Secretariat is the only one that does not have stakes in the process. The Commission has stakes, the European Parliament has stakes, the presidency and the member states, all of them, they're major stakeholders. Even the high representative has stakes in trying to influence sometimes in some files the negotiating process. These are all legitimate stakeholders, and it is only natural that their staffers also behave in a way that brings them in pursuit of the goals envisioned by their political masters. I mean, this is perfectly legitimate in my view. Now, the Council Secretariat happens to be the only body that does not have stakes in the process, whatever the file at hand. I mean, their mission is to keep the Council in deliberation mode. So make sure that the presidency, the member states, bring about, the file through its natural process of negotiation to conclusions. And they do it, in my view, with a high professional standing by providing chairpersons, especially those more in need, as Desmond hinted, with the indispensable support, material support, legal support, policy support, very often tactical support. And, most of the compromise documents, which are tabled and eventually used for compromises in the Council, will come in a very large degree by this collaboration by presidency and secretariat. And I think it's a very positive collaboration, which does not has in its DNA any elements of undue influence. So, my view is that this is a misperception. Now, I cannot avoid coming to the very thorny issue of unanimity and foreign policy, which seems to be, one of the main, emergency issues on the table of most observers. Given that, by and large, I must say, the decision-making process in the QMV areas functions rather well, almost unexpectedly. I think it is now rather fluid, both in terms of the numbers of decisions taken and of the time lag between the time of Commission proposal and decision point, between Council and Parliament. Now, this debate about unanimity in foreign policy, it's a debate that receives very powerful accelerations every time the Union faces a major geopolitical predicament, or otherwise sees its role diminished on the global scene. This happened, with the Balkans wars. It happens with the Arab Spring. It happens with the crisis in Syria and Libya, and recently with the chaotic Western withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I think it's normal. This is only to mention a few graphic examples, but there have been many such situations in which public opinion is frustrated. Many in the institutions voice the need to move forward and do something spectacular, to overcome the troubles with unanimity. Now, this is a debate that most recently has taken a more, let's say, oriented format since the State of the Union address of Juncker in 2018, followed by the Commission communication, on the need to breathe some life into the passerelles provided by the treaty, allowing the European Council to give the Council mandates to move on to qualified majority. President von der Leyen, in her first State of the Union, also called very much for pushing QMV, at least in selected areas such as human rights and sanctions. Where I think one could start incrementally to bring about a culture of overcoming unanimity and so on. I think the EPRS, Anthony, has done some very helpful compendium on this. But my point would be, quite frankly, that personally I remain rather unconvinced that unanimity is the main blocking element to a more efficient foreign policy. Sanctions are about the only measure that we decide anyway. Adding a few more sanctions or more quickly would arguably be a qualifier for our foreign policy effectiveness. The main point is that the sort of choices the EU faces now on the international scene as existential and have to do with massive strategic challenges, not least defining the future of our relations with the difficult but undisputedly influential global actors, starting with China, Russia, soon India, and who knows, maybe we will need to revise or redefine partly at least our relations with the US if some of the current trends continue. Now, any agreement at the global level, whether on climate, whether on pandemic diseases, whether on energy or on Afghanistan, and you name it, I mean, will depend entirely by this sort of, strategic choices. And this is, in my view, the real strategic compass that the EU needs. There is no way such choices can be made by outvoting any of the member states. I don't think through incremental steps that will produce a domino effect. I mean, we're going to get to the point where we're going to have, an influential common foreign policy recognized by the outside world and having a real clout in the development of world affairs. I don't believe in incrementalism. I said, these are very personal views. They do not reflect anyone else's view, and I know they're not very popular, I mean, in the current context, but I think this is frankly the issues at stake. I mean, remember when we set up the euro as a common currency? I mean, this was not incrementalism. I mean, we went with massive political will for a major strategic decision and a lasting one, which, by the way, would have helped the EU speak, with a stronger voice in world affairs. I mean, but we managed to do that by deciding first that it needed an extraordinary integration leap, and then chart the pathway to realize that. So, I mean, this is my, very personal feeling on this. I know this is not a very popular view, but I mean, I'll stop here for the moment, and we'll come back to this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Leonardo. That was extremely interesting and much appreciated insight from the ground, the hard-fought ground, I'm sure, of council decision-making. Last but not least, we have Paulien, who's doing a specialist piece of research on decision-making in external trade policy, and particularly free trade agreements. And welcome to EPRS, our latest visiting scholar. Over to you, Paulien.
Thank you so much. So indeed, I'm a PhD student at the moment at the EUI in Florence. I'm very grateful to be a part of the EPRS at this time. I'm very honored and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a great opportunity. So many thanks, Mr. TEASDALE, for the invitation. I'm going to give a small contribution from my own academic point of view. So indeed, I've been researching on negotiation and implementation of free trade agreements for 2 years now, under the supervision of Professor Joanne Scott. And so I'm grateful that I can provide this roundtable with some examples or some case study, let's say, that comes from my field. So the question I will be addressing is how qualified majority voting and unanimity really work in the Council for the conclusion of free trade agreements. And I actually have 3 key messages or 3 key takeaways that I would like to address shortly. Firstly, how easy or burdensome the conclusion of an FTA depends largely on the voting rules in the Council, of course. Secondly, it also depends considerably on the mixed or EU-only character of these agreements, which then in turn will impact on voting rules in the Council. And finally, and this also has been touched upon, the whole of this is of course crucial for the EU's image internationally as a unitary actor, and also for the bilateral relations with the specific third country concerned. So turning to my first key message, how easy or burdensome the conclusion of an FTA depends largely on voting rules in the Council. The principle is that free trade agreements can be concluded by qualified majority voting. However, there are some exceptions in which unanimity is required. And most importantly, this would be association agreements that often also have a large trade pillar, such as the trade and cooperation agreement with the UK, also the association agreement with Central America, the association agreement that has been negotiated but not yet concluded with the Mercosur countries. And there's also parallel with internal policies. So as has been mentioned before, if we need, for instance, for taxation, unanimity in internal policies, we also need unanimity to conclude a free trade agreement that would cover provisions in this area. Evidently, and this goes back to lots what has been said already, agreements that can be concluded by qualified majority voting will more easily pass through the Council. But in this area specifically, the Council has expressly stated that it is looking for, to the greatest extent possible in any case, for consensus, and as has also been explained before, insisting on individual interest is considerably harder, of course. And therefore, and this brings me to my second key message, Member States will generally prefer to conclude mixed agreements because that allows them to stay present at the international scene as well, and to be together with the European Union parties to these agreements. And then the very important practical impact is that these agreements also require approval of all member states and their parliaments. So even if we then could conclude this agreement by qualified majority voting in the Council, every member state will de facto have a veto because of the need for national approval of these agreements as well. Potentially, this leads to a very time-consuming exercise, can also lead to blocking of this agreement by an individual member state or even the region of an individual member state. And then I'm of course referring to the well-known example of CETA, the trade agreement with Canada that has been blocked for a while by the Walloon Parliament. So generally member states in the Council will prefer mixed agreements. However, we can also think about what this means for legitimacy, because this has also been shortly touched upon a little bit already. To assess this legitimacy, I usually work with the concepts that Vivian Schmidt puts forward. She works with input and output legitimacy, which are well known, but she adds throughput legitimacy to this, which is the quality of the procedures, which also can provide certain guarantees. So I use these to actually look at how can we then assess whether we should go for these mixed agreements or rather EU-only agreements in trade. So for her, very shortly, input legitimacy or politics refers to EU's responsiveness to participation by the people. Throughput legitimacy is the processes, and more concretely, their efficacy, accountability, transparency, and also openness and inclusiveness. And finally, output politics or policies then refers to policy outcomes and their effectiveness. And if we would apply this to free trade agreements, we could say in terms of input legitimacy that the Council itself is only indirectly legitimate, as we've heard before, and which is also mentioned by Vivian Schmidt herself. Not all national parliaments have the same capacities to keep their governments in the Council to account. So if we have a mixed agreement, there is an extra legitimizing actor, because not only the EP will need to give its consent, then national parliaments will also need to scrutinize these agreements. However, if we then look at throughput legitimacy, we can wonder whether the current procedures actually allow these parliaments to properly exercise this democratic role, because both of them are faced with a take it or leave it vote, and there's not necessarily much they can bring up before. But then brings me to output legitimacy, which also has been shortly touched upon before. It is, of course, much more efficient if the Council itself can conclude these free trade agreements by qualified majority voting. And that's also why the current practice, or what happens often, is that now trade provisions are separated from the rest of an agreement to ensure unanimity for these agreements or for these provisions. So these can go quicker and then improve effectiveness in this respect. So of course, all of this is of crucial importance for the EU's image internationally, and the Council, especially for mixed agreement, has developed its constitutional practice of a common accord. So in order to ensure unity in external representation, the Council will wait for the confirmation of all member states that a free trade agreement will be approved by them before it will conclude the agreement itself in the name of the Union then. To limit time loss then, and so to also, of course, recognize that there's this third country involved that is supposed to be, its interests also are supposed to be taken into account. The Council will usually provisionally apply the provisions that come under exclusive EU competences. For trade agreements, that's the majority, the largest majority actually. And this provisional application can also be decided on by qualified majority voting. Normally, my story would have ended here, but the court has very recently, actually beginning of this month, shaken up this reality quite a bit in its opinion 119 on the Istanbul Convention, because it actually deemed this practice of common accords unconstitutional because it's not foreseen in the treaties. So it actually says that the Council could go ahead and conclude an incomplete mixed agreement, that it doesn't have to wait for all member states to give their accord. And this could then, for instance, mean that we could go ahead with CETA, for instance, that we could gather the qualified majority voting, and that then the refusing member states would still be bound by the Council decision for provisions that come under the competences of the Union. Nonetheless, of course, this breaks the unity, and external representation could also lead to international liability. So the court actually added to this conclusion that the Council can still wait and extend its discussions until the largest majority possible, or even a common accord is found. But as of course, as we've heard before, there will still be the shadow of the vote. So it's not entirely sure where we might be going from here. And then I will shortly conclude, so we definitely have time for the discussion. So for the conclusion of free trade agreements, the institutional practice is to look for a consensus in the Council, even if qualified majority would suffice. In the case of a mixed agreement, nonetheless, all member states, all individual member states have their veto. Therefore, the Council has developed its constitutional practice of common accords and will provisionally apply then most of the agreements. Nonetheless, now we might maybe be on our way, that's the question, to some kind of differentiated integration as well in foreign trade policy or foreign policy generally, that is not CFSP. Because there is the possibility to conclude incomplete mixed trade agreements. Of course, the practical impact of this might be limited because most of the, as mentioned before, most of the provisions are part of the EU's competences, and refusing member states would be bound anyway. But still, it's worth reflecting on. So that's the note I end on. Thank you very much. And I would, of course, be very grateful for any advice you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulien. Fascinating insight into that particular aspect of decision making, and I think makes the point that this is a much more complex and multi-layered process than very often the big picture conversation which we have on it suggests. Now, we've so far received about half a dozen questions, and I'm going to read those out and give the panel an opportunity to come back on them. We've got about 20 minutes left. There's still a chance for others to ask questions if they would like to, but probably we can only take 2 or 3 more than the ones which we currently have. So I'm going to just go through these pretty much in the order in which they've been posed. Alexandros Karides asks a question about the merits of extending qualified majority voting in CFSP. Despite my attempt to try and limit the conversation to how QMV and unanimity actually apply, it's inevitable that people are really interested in this, and thank you very much, Leonardo, for already casting some light on it. Alexandros asks, is enlargement to some of the ethnically divided Western Balkan countries a further incentive to extend qualified majority voting to more CFSP issues before that enlargement occurs? And then Stina Sangren asked the following question. Do you think that the Conference on the Future of Europe will lead to what is called here a reform of the use of unanimity, I presume whether by further extensions of QMV or by some other means? Andrew McKinley wonders whether there's a potential for reverse qualified majority voting, which of course is already used in some very technical areas, reverse qualified majority voting to be a solution to problems of blockage under unanimity. And Ralph Drakenberg asks a rather different question, specifically to do with the European Council, and he cites Charles Michel as having stated that the objective of a climate neutral EU by 2050 was the subject of an agreement, even if it seems there was no formal consensus on this question. And he asks, is that a sustainable proposition going forward? And Maria Crago asks a question primarily directed at Sara, but I think one of broader interest as well, about the advantages and disadvantages of introducing greater transparency into the operation of the Council. So the question as to whether that will facilitate and improve decision-making in the Council, or whether it might force it into ever more obscure, what we used to call smoke-filled rooms. And then, if I may, I'd also like to ask a question, which is to do with, we focused on the extension of QMV over time and its impact on decision-making, but has, in the view of our experts today, enlargement made Council decision-making easier or more difficult? And secondly, how do you think that the interaction with the European Parliament has changed the power of certain member states? We've touched on this a little bit, but I think a parliamentary audience is very interested in the interface between the Parliament and the Council in the operation of co-decision. and the extent to which it changes the balance of forces within the Council. So over to the panel, and I propose to start, if I may, from those who were in the middle of the presentation. So I'm going to ask Sara to respond first.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'll only take those questions that I feel I can contribute to, and then I'll let others cover the rest. But there was a specific question directed to me about the transparency, and the very short answer is it depends on which kind of transparency we look at. So transparency, it has been work in progress in the Council for over many years, and we've seen different initiatives introduced. And we can therefore also draw some conclusions about which kinds of transparency initiatives are more effective. On that account, it is important to say that there's a very big difference in the consequences of having more on record and on paper, for example, Council minutes, Council voting records when there's QMV, and that sort of public access to legislative information from the meetings. Compare that to when you have a camera in the room and you can actually follow the live debates. And both based on research from the Council, but also from other legislative institutions in the US, in the Fed, for example, we know that there are consequences in terms of efficiency, in terms of the political behavior of the legislators involved. And if I should make a personal, very quick recommendation, it would be for the Council to have consistent and timely transparency in its records, but not prioritize the public access in, for example, the form of cameras in the room. The dynamics we see is one of being held accountable, or at the other end, the risk of pandering to audiences outside the decision room. So that's the very, very crude overview here. And there are, of course, sort of a spectrum of different transparency measures that can be considered in between those. But transparency is, of course, a way to hold decision makers accountable and for also ensuring legitimacy. There's no doubt about that. But it is very important to identify which kinds of transparency initiatives can bring us closer to that goal, rather than risking that we cannot find agreements between decision makers, or that decision makers do not, in fact, negotiate the issues on the table, but start making political speeches to other audiences. On the issue of, or the question of the conference of the future of Europe, Richard will be better placed to answer this, but my expectation would not be that we would see the QMV extension come out based on the conclusion from that work. That would be, that it has to be driven by the member state preferences, and I don't see that right now. I think I will finish here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sara. Maybe next go to Washington, and Desmond, any reflections on the various questions posed?
Yes, Anthony, thank you. First of all, your question, or one of your questions about the relationship between enlargement and qualified majority voting. I think it's useful to bear in mind that these two processes in the history of European integration went hand in hand. They weren't necessarily negotiated in the same forum, but there was an awareness that precisely because there would be more players as a result of enlargement, it was important to improve the efficiency of decision making, and therefore in intergovernmental conferences that happened about the same time, a big question was the extension of qualified majority voting in certain policy fields. And so if you think of the Single European Act being negotiated at about the same time as the Mediterranean enlargement, the Maastricht Treaty and the treaty changes that followed being negotiated at the time of the first post-Maastricht enlargement when Austria, Finland and Sweden joined, and then the big enlargement and the parallel discussions that took place in the conference on the convention, constitutional convention that is, and subsequently the constitutional treaty and then the Lisbon Treaty. So the expectation was that qualified majority voting, that the extension in the use of qualified majority voting was very important at a time of enlargement. As to the complexity, of course, qualified majority voting has become, when I say more complex, more challenging, because the actors involved need to know the positions of more member states. But they're very good at that. We've spoken about that already, about the expertise of the officials in the Council Secretariat, about the expertise of the presidency with the help of the Council Secretariat. One of the questions I would address is Ralph's question, and I think Ralph is referring to the December 2019 European Council, at which the big question that needed to be resolved on the agenda had to do with reaching agreement on the EU becoming climate neutral by 2050, and there was one recalcitrant member state. It was, of course, Poland. And what happened at the end of the meeting is Poland held out, and then Charles Michel, who was presiding over his first European Council as European Council president, I think in the euphoria of the moment, in his post-summit statement, he said, yes, we have reached an agreement, whereas in fact, 26 of the 27 had reached an agreement. And the conclusions reflected that. In other words, the conclusions did not say, this is an agreement of the European Council. So I think the problem there was more Charles Michel's enthusiasm and euphoria, and the way he phrased this in his press conference. And indeed, he was generally taken to task by the media. I remember the Financial Times referred to his statement as a bout of Belgian surrealism. However, I would say this, there are examples, of course, in the European Council of a political agreement being reached, but not everybody signing on to it. And a very good example of this, and a counterintuitive example of this, is that when the European Council reached a political agreement on the jobs package in late June, early July of 2019, and primarily on the nomination of Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President, of all people, Chancellor Merkel, I don't know if the formal word is abstained, but she did not take a position, and that had to do with domestic German politics. So we have examples in the European Council of the European Council reaching an agreement, but not everybody signing on to that agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful indeed. I'm going to pass over now to Leonardo.
Thank you, Anthony. I mean, on the question of enlargement, I mean, there's no doubt that, I mean, the wider you go in terms of membership, I mean, the more complicated decision processes become. So, I mean, I think it's an understatement to say that, I mean, enlargement has an impact also on the voting patterns and on the question of fashioning a voting system that will maintain some coherence. I mean, in spite of new sensitivities being added to the table, not just on CFSP, but on a number of other issues. I mean, we are experiencing currently quite some, interesting problems with, some of the members which have joined more recently the pack of member states. For the same reasons, I think enlargement negotiations have become some of the most complex and some of the more difficult, inextricable at times, precisely because, I mean, there is a mixture there of institutional aspects that need to be sorted out and, policy and internal functioning aspects which have to do with, maintaining the machine on track towards, deliberating. This is actually part of, it's one of the Copenhagen criteria, one of the criteria on which several member states are putting much stress recently. So even where, if you want, the geopolitical context is heavily conducive, I mean, to widening the geographic borders of Europe to an area like the Western Balkans region, I mean, which is so close and so closely integrated economically and so strategic for a number of reasons, not least, migration flows and others, and competing influence of other major actors. I mean, you still have major reservations about, the way this is going to be projected in the functioning of the machine. And do not forget, I mean, ultimately, this is an intergovernmental negotiations, I mean, in which the Council and even the European Council have an instrumental role. The Commission, of course, has its main role of negotiator, etc. But everything ends, every step in the way with an intergovernmental decision and with an intergovernmental conference in which the member states are the sole arbiters. I mean, and there are no other actors playing at the table.
Many thanks for that, Leonardo. Over to Paulien.
Yes, many thanks. I think I will just touch upon two things that might also have an interesting input from my field. Firstly, to what Professor Hagemann said about transparency, it's also the type of transparency is also very relevant in trade policy, for instance, because we see there that there's a very certainly a very improved transparency of trade documents, the negotiation mandate, for instance. But there are also commentators who then tell or then have to make the conclusion that the negotiating mandate that is adopted by the Council and then given to the Commission as a negotiator will remain vaguer because they know that everything will be published by the Commission then. So there's always a bit, I think, this trade-off as well. So I just wanted to give an addition to this from my field. And then a bit more on how the European Parliament comes in, which was something that Mr. TEASDALE brought up. In trade policy, of course, if there's more transparency in the relationship between the Commission and the Council, this will benefit the European Parliament automatically. And this also touches upon a little bit the question that I got in the chat addressed to me on the different types of agreements that I have discussed and how their legitimacy could be different. So very shortly, in case of mixed agreements, of course, we have more legitimizing actors because in addition to the Council, we have national parliaments that are not only providing indirect legitimacy, but also directly involved. EU-only agreements would, in terms of input legitimacy, maybe be a bit different, but on the other hand, I think the role of the European Parliament is of particular importance to provide legitimacy and also maybe to take on board some of the concerns of national parliaments, and that then goes to throughput legitimacy. And finally, for incomplete mixed agreements could actually be said to be an important consequence of direct input legitimacy, because in the end, this is about national parliaments exercising their right to also refuse some of these agreements. At the same time, it can be discussed whether they should be able to refuse an agreement on all grounds, so also on grounds that fall within exclusive EU competences. But that's a whole other discussion that might be served for another time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulien. And then finally, over to Richard.
The question was asked whether the Conference on the Future of Europe will look at this issue. Certainly, if you look at what citizens have been putting up on the digital platform, which often reflects discussions that have been taking place across Europe in seminars, town hall meetings, and so on, and also what the randomly chosen citizens panels have been discussing. In both cases, this question has featured quite prominently. It's seen as being linked to the capacity of the EU to deliver things that citizens are demanding of the EU, usually, but not always, things that are already within the competence of the EU, where unanimity is seen as a problem of holding up delivery. It's also seen as a problem of democracy. Should one minister be able to block a decision that an overwhelming majority want? So it will come up. Whether the outcome of the conference and the follow-up to the conference means there will be a change is another question, of course, because to change from unanimity to QMV, as we mentioned earlier, needs itself a unanimous decision of one kind or another. But the issue is posed. It also does come up in the context of enlargement, both in the discussions in the conference and anyway, because the more member states you have, the more veto players you have in the fields that need unanimity. And of course, the greater the danger of a rogue state. Statistically, if you have 30-odd member states after the Western Balkans join and you have complete paralysis, hypothetically, in one or another, or a complete hostility in one or another, or God forbid, a third country's interests have an external country outside of Europe perhaps have a very high level of influence in the government of the country concerned, and this can apply to current member states too, of course, with a veto right within the European Union. Of course, the question of unanimity is posed if we are going to enlarge further. And the argument then comes up, if you are saying that the EU should deal with the subject, it makes no sense to confer competences on the EU and then see it paralyzed by a decision-taking procedure that means that you either have no decision or you have the lowest common denominator. If you don't want the European Union to deal with the subject, keep it as a national competence. But if you do want to do something jointly at European level, then you have to give the EU adequate tools to actually take decisions, the capacity to act. And increasingly, that involves a discussion about the decision-taking procedure and unanimity versus QMV. Now, you might say, well, why should member states give up their veto rights? And seen from the point of view of any individual country, the first reaction might be, no, we don't, we want our right to veto, it's very important. But when they start reflecting that if you have a veto, so does everybody else. Do you really want the things that you want to achieve at European level to be subject to a veto in the future by Bosnia-Herzegovina, for instance? Or to take a current member state by Malta, for instance, or wherever. And that, of course, explains why in successive intergovernmental conferences, governments have accepted to extend the field of qualified majority voting instead of unanimity. That has happened time and time again, because they realize that, yeah, it's nice to have a veto, but if you've got one, so does everybody else, and they can veto things that you want. And that argument is going to be crucial over the coming years.
Thank you very much, Richard. We've come to the end of our time, so it falls to me to thank our panelists very much for what I think has been an extremely broad-ranging and deep discussion about decision-making in the Council, and we're most grateful to everybody who's shared their thoughts, including those who asked questions, as well as the 150 or so people who've been online to take part as part of the digital audience. So we much appreciate your commitment and attendance at these kinds of events. The next EPRS event will be in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be on Tuesday, the 9th of November, again at lunchtime. It's an EPRS book talk. And Bart Savich from Sciences Po in Paris and from the German Marshall Fund will be in conversation with Radek Sikorski, MEP, and Florence Gaub from the EU Institute for Security Studies about two books which he's published recently. One is called Europe's Grand Strategy, Navigating a New World Order, very much in the geopolitical context of his own personal interest in the work of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And his second book, Partners of First Resort, America, Europe, and the Future of the West. In other words, what is the role of transatlantic relations in today and tomorrow's world? So we look forward very much to that. But today we say thank you to our panel and thank you to you, and have a most enjoyable and agreeable afternoon. Bye-bye.